Welcome to Sleepy Harbour. Settle in. There is nothing left for you to do tonight, nothing that needs deciding, nothing that has to be finished before you let yourself drift. The lamp is low, the blanket is heavy in the way you like it, and the only thing asked of you for the next long while is to lie still and let a quiet voice carry you somewhere slow. You do not have to follow every word. That is the secret of a night like this. You can lose the thread and find it again, or lose it and never find it, and either way you will have arrived exactly where you were always going. So let your shoulders come down from wherever they have been holding themselves. Let the back of your head grow heavy against the pillow. And let me tell you a story about time, and about the dark, and about the strange and gentle trick your own mind plays on you in the small hours of the night. I want to begin underground. In the summer of 1962, a young French geologist named Michel Siffre climbed down into a cave in the French-Italian Alps, into a place called the Scarasson Chasm, and he stayed there, alone, in the cold and the dark, for 61 days. He had no clock, he had no watch, he had no sunlight, no window, no glow of morning through a curtain, none of the small daily signals the rest of us use, without even noticing to tell us where we are in the turning of a day. He had a tent pitched on the floor of the cave, near the lip of an underground glacier, and he had a telephone line running up to a team of colleagues waiting at the surface, and he had one strict rule that he had set for himself. He would call up to them whenever he woke, whenever he ate, and whenever he was about to sleep. But he would never, ever ask them what time it was. He wanted to see what would happen to a human being cut loose from the sun. He wanted to know what his body would do with time when time was left entirely to itself. And here is the thing that happened, the thing that has kept people telling this story for more than 60 years. When the experiment was over, when his team finally called down to him and told him it was finished, that he could come up now, Michel Siffre did not believe them. Because by his own reckoning, by the careful count he had been keeping in his head and in his notes all those weeks in the dark, it was still the middle of August. He thought there were weeks to go. He thought he was only part-way through. But up at the surface, in the world of daylight and calendars and clocks, it was the middle of September. He had lost a month, a whole month. Gone, vanished, misplaced somewhere in the darkness of that cave, unaccounted for and unnoticed. He had lived through those 30 missing days. He had woken and eaten and slept through them, one after another, and somehow, without ever meaning to, without any single moment where he could have said, "There, that is where I lost it." He had let an entire month slip through his hands like water. Sit with that for a moment. A man loses a month, and he does not feel it go. He counts carefully, he keeps notes, he is a trained scientist doing the one thing he came down there to do, and still, at the end, his account of how long he has been away is off by roughly 30 days. Not 30 minutes, not 30 hours, 30 days. Now you might think that is the strangest thing about the human sense of time. A man in a cave, cut off from the world, drifting a month adrift from the calendar. But I want to tell you tonight that it is not strange at all, or rather that it is exactly as strange as what happens to you, in your own bed, on an ordinary night, when you cannot sleep, and the dark seems to stretch out around you with no end to it, and you lie there certain, absolutely certain, that you have been awake for hours. Because the two things, the man losing his month and you losing your night, are the same thing. They come from the same place. They are built by the same machinery, working exactly as it was designed to work. And by the end of this long, slow story, I hope you will understand that machinery so well that the next time the dark seems to go on forever, you will feel the corner of a small, quiet smile, because you will know what is really happening. And knowing it, I think, makes the night softer. But before we go any further, I would love to know where you are listening from tonight. Somewhere out there in the dark, you are lying in a room I will never see, in a city or a town or a quiet stretch of countryside, in one time zone or another, at your own particular hour of the night. If you feel like it, and only if it costs you nothing, leave a word in the comments telling me where in the world you are drifting off from. I read them, all of them, usually with my own cup of something warm, and there is something I find quietly wonderful about the map of all of us, scattered across the earth, all listening to the same slow voice at the same strange hour. And if this is your first night here at Sleepy Harbour, and you would like more of these slow journeys, you can subscribe and they will find their way to you. That is all, no more asking. From here on, it is just you and me, and the dark and the long story of time. So, let me tell you the thing that sits underneath all of this. The one fact that everything else tonight is going to grow out of. It is a small fact, and a very large one at the same time, and it is this. You do not have a clock. I do not mean you have forgotten your watch. I mean that nowhere inside your head, nowhere in the soft grey folds of your brain, is there an organ whose job is to measure how much time has passed. Think for a moment about your other senses and how differently they are built. When light falls on you, it lands on the eye, an actual instrument, a dedicated piece of biological machinery with a lens and a screen of receptors, built for one purpose, to catch light and turn it into seeing. When a sound reaches you, it enters the ear, another instrument, a spiral of fluid and tiny hairs tuned to tremble at the pitch of the world, built for one purpose, to catch sound and turn it into hearing. You have an organ for light. You have an organ for sound. You have organs for smell and taste, and for the pressure of the mattress against your back right now. Every one of your senses reaches out into the world through a specialized piece of the body made for catching one kind of thing. But there is no organ for time. There is nowhere in your body a small clock, a pacemaker ticking away in a chamber somewhere that you could point to and say, there, that is the thing that measures my hours. When neuroscientists went looking for it, in a great deal of careful work summarized by two researchers named Buhusi and Mek, in a review published in 2005, what they found was not a clock at all. What they found was that the sense of time is smeared across the brain, borrowed from many different regions, none of which was built for timekeeping, all of them lending a hand at once. There is a region deep in the middle of the brain called the basal ganglia, a cluster of structures more famous for helping you move, for smoothing out the start and stop of a reach or a step. And it turns out to be involved in timing too. There is the cerebellum, the dense little knot at the back and base of the skull, the part that keeps you balanced and coordinates the fine timing of a catch or a swing, and it lends itself to the sense of duration as well. There is a strip near the top of the brain called the supplementary motor area, which helps plan and sequence your movements, the ordering of one action after another, and it too is part of the timing story. And there is a fold buried deep in the side of the brain called the insular cortex, the part that listens inward to the beat of your heart and the rise of your breath, and the whole quiet weather of your body, and it, too, is part of how you feel time pass. Notice what all of those have in common. Not one of them is a clock. Every one of them was built to do some other job: movement, balance, sequence. The sensing of the body and the feeling of time is something the brain assembles out of all of them working together, a kind of committee, a rough consensus stitched together from many parts that were each hired to do something else entirely. You do not read the time off an instrument the way you read light off the eye. You infer it. You piece it together. You make an estimate, the way you might guess how far you have walked, not by measuring, but by the ache in your legs and the number of streets you remember passing. And that word infer is the whole secret of the night. Because a measurement and an inference are two very different things. A measurement is taken directly, in the moment, from the thing itself. A ruler laid against a table gives you the length of the table, right then, from the table. But an inference is a guess assembled from clues, and clues can be missing, and clues can mislead. And the same set of clues can be read two completely different ways, depending on when you look and what you are looking for. Your sense of light is a measurement. Your sense of time is a guess. A very good guess, most of the time, in the daylight, with the world moving around you and giving you 1,000 things to guess from. But a guess, all the same. And at night, in the dark, in the stillness, when the clues run thin, the guess can go quietly and dramatically wrong. So here is the promise I want to make to you, the one I am going to spend this whole long night keeping. You know the feeling. Everyone knows the feeling. You lie down. You close your eyes. And sleep does not come. Instead, the mind starts turning, and the dark presses in, and you shift, and you turn the pillow to the cool side, and you tell yourself to stop thinking, which of course only makes the thinking louder, and at some point you become aware that a great deal of time has passed. An hour, you think. Maybe 2. Maybe more. And in the morning you say it out loud, to yourself or to someone else. I was awake for hours. I hardly slept. I lay there half the night. And for a very long time, the world has had 2 things to say to that complaint, and both of them are unkind. The first thing the world says is, well, you have a problem, here is how to fix your sleep, here are the rules, here is the routine, here is what you are doing wrong. And the second thing the world says, sometimes gently and sometimes not, is that you are exaggerating, that you were not really awake for hours, that it only felt that way, that if we had watched you, we would have seen you sleeping far more than you think, and your sense of the endless night is, in the end, a kind of harmless little lie you tell yourself. I am not going to say either of those things to you tonight, because both of them are wrong, and the truth is far more interesting and far kinder than either. Here is the truth. The feeling that you were awake for hours is not a lie, it is a real thing. It is a genuine output of the machinery in your head, produced correctly by a system doing exactly what it evolved to do. When you feel that the night went on, you are not lying to yourself, and you are not broken, and you are not even, in the way that matters most, wrong. You are experiencing a real perceptual effect. It has a mechanism. It has a name, or several names, which we will come to. It can be measured in a laboratory. It happens to almost everyone. And it is not a flaw in you. It is a natural and predictable consequence of the fact we just uncovered, that you have no clock, and that your sense of time is not a measurement, but a reconstruction. That word is the key that will open every door tonight, so let me set it down gently and turn it over in the low light. Reconstruction, your sense of how long something took, is not read off a dial while it is happening. It is rebuilt afterward, from memory, from the pieces left behind. When you ask yourself, how long was I lying there, you are not consulting an internal stopwatch that has been dutifully counting the whole time. There is no such stopwatch. Instead, your mind does something much more like what an archaeologist does, or a detective, or someone coming home to a room and trying to work out how long they have been gone by looking at what has changed. It looks back over the stretch of time in question, and it asks, in effect, how much happened in there? How many distinct things do I remember? How much stuff is stored back there in that span? And from the amount of stuff, it builds a guess about the length. Sit with how odd that is, because it is going to explain everything. Your brain estimates the length of a period of time by how much you remember happening in it. Not by how long it actually was, by how full it was. A stretch of time crowded with distinct, separate, memorable events gets reconstructed as long. Because look at all this that happened, surely all of that took a while. And a stretch of time with almost nothing in it, almost nothing distinct, almost nothing stored, ought, by that logic, to be reconstructed as short. And often it is. But at night, something turns that logic inside out, and it is the most fascinating part of the whole story, and we will get there, slowly, in time. For now, hold on to the shape of the reveal. It has two halves, and they fit together like cupped hands. The first half is the thing you already half suspected and were maybe half ashamed of. The night really did feel long. That feeling is real, it is not weakness, it is not drama, it is the honest report of a system doing its work. And the second half is the quiet, surprising gift hidden inside the first. If the night felt long because your mind reconstructs duration from how much it remembers happening, and if almost nothing happened because you were lying still in the dark circling the same worry or the same thought over and over, then the very endlessness of the feeling is a clue. It is evidence. It is your own mind telling you, without meaning to, that very little actually took place. And if very little took place, then, very possibly, far less time has passed than it feels like. The endless feeling night and the short in truth night are not enemies. They are the same night, seen from two sides. The feeling of forever is not the opposite of the truth. The feeling of forever is made out of the truth. But I am running ahead of myself, and this is a night for going slowly. Let me come back down into the cave, because there is more to Michel Siffre than a lost month, and because his story lets us feel, from the outside, the very thing that happens to you from the inside. Picture him down there. The cave is cold, close to freezing, the damp seeping into everything, his tent pitched on the rock near that underground glacier. A small pool of lamplight in an ocean of black stone. There is no morning. That is the thing that is almost impossible to imagine from up here, in a world where morning always comes, where even on the worst night the light eventually greys the edges of the curtains and tells you, all right, it is over, the day is here, you made it. Down there, morning never comes. There is only the lamp, and the dark beyond it, and the cold, and the sound of his own breathing, and the far-off drip of water moving through the rock the way it has moved for longer than there have been people to hear it. He sleeps when he feels tired. He wakes when he wakes. He eats when he is hungry. He phones the surface to mark each of these, waking, eating, sleeping. And he keeps his own private count of the days, and he is careful, and he is diligent, and he is a scientist, and still, across 61 real days, his count drifts a full month behind the truth. Why? What was happening to him day after day in the dark that let a whole month slip past uncounted? He was not asleep the whole time. He was awake, alert, working, thinking, writing. He was paying attention. And that, strangely, is part of the answer, though we will have to earn it slowly. But feel, for now, just the shape of it. A man in the dark, without the sun, without the ordinary markers of a day, loses his grip on time, and it does not feel to him like losing his grip. It feels, from the inside, completely normal. Each day feels like a day. He is not aware, in the moment, of any slippage at all. The error only shows itself at the very end, when his private world of the cave is finally laid against the public world of the calendar, and the gap yawns open, 30 days wide. And here is the bridge, the thing I most want you to carry into sleep tonight. What happened to Michel Siffre over 61 days in a cave is a slow, extreme, dramatic version of what happens to you over a few hours in a dark bedroom. He lost the sun, and his sense of time came loose from the truth. You, when you cannot sleep, also lose the sun. You are also in the dark. You are also without the markers of a day. And your sense of time also comes loose from the truth, and drifts and lands somewhere it should not be. His drift ran one way, toward too little, so that a month felt like nothing. Yours, in the sleepless night, often runs the other way, so that a little feels like a lot. But it is the same, coming loose. It is the same machinery, freed from its usual anchors, doing its best in the dark and getting it wrong. And there is nothing broken about it. It is simply what this borrowed, cobbled together, no-clock sense of time does when you take away the sun. Because think about how much the ordinary day quietly does for you, how much timekeeping you outsource to the world without ever knowing it. In the daylight, you almost never have to work at knowing roughly what time it is. The light itself tells you, sliding from the thin gold of morning to the flat white of midday to the long amber of evening. Your body tells you, the slow build of hunger toward a meal, the mid-afternoon dip, the heaviness that gathers as night comes on. The world around you tells you, the traffic thickening and thinning, the sounds of other people beginning and ending their days, the shadows swinging around like the hand of a great slow clock laid over the whole landscape. You are surrounded at every moment of the day by an enormous, redundant web of signals, all quietly agreeing with each other about what time it is. And your no-clock brain leans on that web constantly, reading the time off the world the way you might read it off 100 clocks, all showing the same hour. You do not measure time. You infer it from the world. And the world, in the daylight, is generous with clues. Now take all of that away. Turn off the light. Silence the house. Send everyone else to sleep. Draw the curtains against the last of the street lamp glow. Lie down and be still, and close your eyes. In one gentle motion you have stripped away almost the entire web of signals your sense of time depends on. No sliding light, no moving shadows, no sounds of the world turning, no shift of hunger, because you ate hours ago and will not eat again till morning. Just you, and the dark, and the mattress, and your own slow breath, and the turning of your own mind. You have, without meaning to, done to yourself, in miniature, exactly what Michel Siffre did to himself on purpose in that cave. You have cut your no-clock brain loose from the sun. And you should not be surprised, then, that it does what his did. It drifts. It loses its grip. It reconstructs the night from the almost nothing you have given it to work with, and it hands you back a number that has very little to do with the truth. This is why time feels different in the dark. Not because the dark is magic. Not because the night is longer than the day, though on some nights it certainly feels that way. But because the dark removes the scaffolding, the great redundant web of signals your borrowed sense of time leans on, and leaves the machinery to guess in the void. And a guess in a void is a strange and unreliable thing. So that is where we begin, and where I will leave the first part of this long night story, with the two of them held side by side in the low light. A man underground who lost a month and did not feel it go. And you in your bed who can lose track of an hour or find that a handful of minutes has swollen into what feels like half the night. Both of you cut loose from the sun. Both of you running on the same no-clock machinery, the timing borrowed from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum and the supplementary motor area and the deep listening fold of the insular cortex, none of them a clock. All of them lending a hand. All of them doing their honest best to build a sense of time out of clues that, in the dark, have all but disappeared. And both of you, in the end, not wrong, not lying, not broken, simply human, and in the dark, and reconstructing. I told you your feeling of the endless night is a real perceptual effect, and I promised you it has a name, and a mechanism, and proof. Over the rest of this night, I am going to give you all of it, slowly, one gentle piece at a time. I am going to show you exactly how the mind builds its sense of duration out of what materials, and why the dark starves it of those materials until it has almost nothing left to build with. I am going to show you the two different clocks, the one that runs while you wait and the one that runs while you remember, and why the sleepless night is caught so cruelly between them. I am going to take you down into the caves again, into Mammoth Cave in Kentucky, and a bunker in Germany, and a second, longer cave in Texas, where Siffre's very seconds stretched until 2 minutes took 5. I am going to tell you what really happens to time inside a dream, and whether the old story of living a whole lifetime in a single second is true or a beautiful myth. I am going to tell you about people dropped, on purpose, into freefall who a certain time had slowed, and about the clever little wrist device that proved it hadn't, and I am going to bring you at the very end to the sleep laboratories where people who swear they lay awake half the night are shown, on the recording, to have been sleeping, and where we finally learn the real name for what happens to you, and why it is not your fault, and why it is not even, in the way that counts, a mistake. But all of that is for later, for the deeper hours. For now, there is nothing you need to hold on to. Let the two figures blur if they want to, the man in the cave and the person in the bed, until you cannot quite tell which is which, until they are just a single shape lying in the dark somewhere, at peace, cut loose from the sun and drifting, and untroubled by it. Let the number melt. Let go of how long you have been lying here, and how long you have left, and whether it is more or less than it feels. You do not have to keep the count. That is the whole point of everything I am telling you. You were never really keeping it anyway. Your brain was only ever guessing. So let it guess without you tonight. Let it drift a month behind the calendar, if it likes. There is nowhere you have to be, and no time you have to keep. You are moored here, in the warm dark, and the tide is going out slowly, and there is a great deal more of this quiet story still to come. Consider, for a moment, the question of how a memory gets its length, not its content, not what happened, but how it gets the particular quality of feeling long or short. The sense that an afternoon lasted a week, or that a whole winter collapsed into something you could hold in two hands. You might assume that time is simply recorded as it passes, the way a camera records, a steady, unbroken stream with a timestamp at every frame. You might assume that when you look back at a memory and say that felt short, or that went on forever, you are consulting some kind of internal ledger, a count of minutes the brain kept as it went. But that is not what the brain does. The brain does not keep a ledger. It does not run a counter. There is no part of the mind quietly ticking off the seconds the way a clock ticks in a quiet room. What the brain does is something stranger, and it is the thing that explains everything that happens to time in the dark. The psychologist Robert Ornstein wrote a book in 1969 called On the Experience of Time, and in it he proposed something that sounds simple until you follow it all the way to its conclusion. He proposed that the felt length of any interval of time, any stretch of experience you live through, scales with how much information the mind manages to store during it, more distinct encoded events, a longer remembered duration, less stored, a shorter one. A richer interval does not just feel richer, it feels, literally, longer, and an empty one, a stretch of hours during which very little distinct or memorable occurred, does not just feel blank. In memory, it collapses, it compresses. It becomes, looking back, almost nothing at all. Think about what that means for the afternoon you spent doing something you loved. If you were absorbed in it, if the afternoon was packed with small shifts and discoveries and moments of recognition, then the hours laid down a great deal of material, and looking back on that afternoon from the distance of a week, it seems to extend. You remember it as ample. You say it felt like a long time. What you mean, without knowing you mean it, is that there was a lot of it to store. A lot of distinct things the mind could reach for when it tried to reconstruct how much had happened. And then consider the afternoon that vanished, the one you spent waiting, or doing something repetitive, or lying still in a room with nothing changing around you. In the moment, it may have dragged, but the next day, looking back, there was almost nothing there. The whole stretch had compressed into a single colour, a single texture. It took up almost no space in the reconstruction. You would say it went fast, meaning only that it left almost nothing behind. This is Ornstein's idea, and it is not a metaphor. It is a description of a mechanism. The mind estimates duration the way a traveller estimates distance, not by consulting a readout, but by counting how many distinct things were passed along the way. Many things passed, long journey. Few things, short one. And the problem, the beautiful, terrible problem, is that what counts as a distinct thing, what counts as a landmark the memory can register, is not simply something that happened, it is something the mind noticed as new. And this is where another piece of the mechanism arrives, because the mind does not treat all experiences equally. There is a second process running beneath awareness that is constantly deciding what counts as a landmark and what gets folded into the ongoing sameness. Jeffrey Zacks, a cognitive scientist, and his colleagues described it in 2007 in work that gave the process a precise name. They called it event segmentation theory. The idea is this: the mind does not experience time as a continuous stream. It experiences it as a series of discrete events, not because the world is actually divided into events the way a chapter is divided into pages, but because the brain is constantly chopping up the continuous flow of experience into segments. It does this automatically, without any effort on your part. It is something your mind is doing right now, and it was doing it this afternoon, and it will do it tomorrow. What triggers a new segment, what the researchers call an event boundary, is a change of place, or action, or topic, or goal. Something shifts, and the boundary falls. These boundaries are the raw material the duration estimate is built from. The more of them a stretch of time contains, the more units the mind has to work with when it later tries to reconstruct how long that stretch was. A morning that contained many changes of place and action and thought. A morning that was varied, that moved, lays down many boundaries, and later the mind, reaching back, finds a great deal of structure there. The morning feels, in retrospect, like a long morning. A morning of one thing, one thought, one place, one steady sameness lays down almost nothing. And later the mind, reaching back, finds a near blank. You can see already where this is going. You can feel the shape of the argument beginning to settle into something familiar, something that describes exactly the texture of a night lying awake in the dark. But let us take it one step further, one layer deeper, because there is a third piece of the mechanism that makes the night specifically strange, and it is the piece that involves what the darkness actually takes away from you. Vision is the richest boundary generator the waking mind has. This is not a small point. The vast majority of event boundaries in ordinary waking life are visual. A scene changes around you. Something moves. A face turns. A doorway passes. The light shifts. All of these are registered as changes, as segmentation events, and each one contributes to the dense, complex map of elapsed time that the mind builds from a waking day. When you move through the world with your eyes open, you are constantly, effortlessly laying down landmarks. The world is writing the story of elapsed time on your behalf, and the currency it uses is difference, novelty, change, and then the lights go off. In the dark, that stream is gone. The richest source of event boundaries the mind has access to is simply absent. The room does not change, the space does not shift. There is no motion, no new face, no new scene. The visual world, which in waking life produces a nearly continuous rain of segmentation events, has gone entirely silent. What is left? Sound, which in a quiet room at night is also largely absent. The body, heartbeat, breath, the small adjustments of a person trying to find comfort, but these are rhythmic and repetitive, which means they are not novel, and it is novelty that generates boundaries, not mere activity. And thought, circling, one repeated thought. Or two, but they are the same thought wearing different words. And here the fourth piece of the mechanism arrives, and it is perhaps the most precise explanation of why that particular night, the night of the circling thought, the night of the one thing that will not stop, reports as so impossibly long. There is an effect in the study of time perception called the oddball effect, and it was documented carefully, with specific measurements, by Peter Tsay and his colleagues in 2004, and by Vani Pariyadath and David Eagleman in 2007. The oddball effect works like this. If you show someone a series of repeated identical stimuli, the same shape, the same sound, the same image, over and over, and then slip in a single different one, something novel, something that breaks the pattern, that single oddball stimulus is perceived as lasting longer than the identical stimuli around it, even when the actual duration is exactly the same. The odd one out feels bigger in time. The mind gives it more. Why? Because the brain's response to a stimulus, the size of the neural reaction it produces, is larger when the stimulus is novel and shrinks with repetition. This is called repetition suppression. The more the brain has seen something, the quieter its response becomes, because it has already built a model of the thing and no longer needs to invest as much in processing it. The first time, the brain attends fully. The 10th time, it barely stirs. And because the subjective sense of duration tracks the size of the brain's response, the repeated stimulus feels shorter. The novel one feels longer. The brain is spending more of itself on the novel thing, and that expenditure, that metabolic and attentional investment, is what the mind reports as duration. Now apply this to the repeated thought at 3 in the morning. The thought is not new the 5th time it comes around. It is not new the 15th time. Every repetition suppresses the brain's response to it a little further. Every pass through the same loop is a quieter event than the one before. And quieter events produce less material for the duration reconstruction to work with. Less material, a shorter remembered stretch. The repetitive thought is building almost no architecture in memory, laying down almost no event boundaries, generating almost no novelty for the oddball mechanism to give weight to, and yet the night feels long. Hold that contradiction, because it is the heart of everything, and we will return to it. For now, let us simply note what is accumulating, a set of conditions that are all pointing in the same direction. Darkness, which removes the visual boundary generator. Stillness, which removes the spatial and physical cues. Repetition, which suppresses the brain's response to the one thought circling, and the body lying in the same position in the same room, producing no new segmentation events, generating no new material for the reconstruction of elapsed time to draw from. A structureless stretch, almost nothing for the storage size model to work with, and yet the certain feeling that the night has gone on for a very long time. The reason for that contradiction is precisely what part 3 of this story will unfold. The other system, the prospective one, the one that runs in real time rather than in memory, and which behaves exactly backwards from the retrospective one. But before we get there, there is one more piece of the reconstruction story to lay down, because it closes a loop that many people carry around without realizing it closes so cleanly. You have almost certainly felt at some point in your life that time moved more slowly when you were young, that summers stretched, that a week before a birthday felt like a geological epoch, that a single afternoon of childhood had a spaciousness that no adult afternoon has managed to replicate. And you have probably heard the explanation that is usually offered for this, that each year of life is a smaller fraction of the whole, so a year at 7 is a large portion of all the time you have ever known, whereas a year at 40 is a thin slice of a much larger number. This is the proportional theory, and it has a certain mathematical elegance. And it has been repeated in many forms in many places. But there is another explanation, one that sits more precisely on the mechanism we have just been building, and which the work of the researcher Sylvie Droit-Vollet points toward. When you are a child, far more of your daily experience is novel. An ordinary afternoon contains a greater density of genuine novelty per hour. Things the brain has not yet built a compressed model for, things it must attend to fully rather than scan and dismiss. The world has not yet repeated itself enough to suppress the response. The kitchen is still interesting. The walk to school still registers as a sequence of distinct and worthy events. There are more boundaries per hour, more segmentation events, more oddball moments when something breaks the pattern, because the pattern is not yet fully learned. As the years pass, the world repeats, the commute becomes invisible, the familiar rooms stop generating boundaries. The habits that once required attention now run on something close to automatic. Fewer and fewer events require the full investment of the brain's response. And so fewer and fewer leave the deep marks that the duration reconstruction will later reach for. The remembered days compress, the years accelerate, not because the clock is running faster, but because the storage is thinner. This is a much more precise reframing of what most people mean when they say time moves faster as you age. It is not about the fraction. It is about the density of novelty per unit of time. A year in which many new and distinct things happened, in which the world produced a high rate of genuine segmentation events, will remember as long. A year of settled, familiar routine, however pleasant, will compress. You can, in principle, slow the subjective passage of years by filling them with genuine novelty, not frantically, not anxiously, but with the quiet deliberateness of someone who knows what currency is being spent. This is not a productivity prescription, it is a description of the mechanism. The proportional explanation is a late note, the novelty density explanation is the root. And all of this, the Ornstein model and the Zacks segmentation and the oddball effect and the repetition suppression and the novelty density account of age, all of it traces back to the same underlying fact. The brain does not have a clock. It has only what happened. It counts what it stored. And in the dark, on a still night, with a single thought going around the same loop, it has stored almost nothing. The reconstruction, when it runs, will reach for material and find the architecture nearly bare. Let us rest here for a moment in what that means. The night that feels endless is a night that left almost nothing behind. The feeling of endlessness is not evidence that many hours passed. It is, in a precise and almost paradoxical way, evidence of the opposite. A night rich with distinct events, with shifts and surprises and genuine novelty, would in retrospect remember as long, but it would not feel endless while it was happening, because the material being laid down would be giving the mind something to do, something to process, something to build with. The particular texture of the night that will not end. That specific, grinding sense of an eternal sameness is the feeling generated by a mind that is running the prospective timing system in real time, monitoring the dark with nothing new to report, while the storage size model runs quietly on the side and deposits almost nothing into the ledger. You will have more of that, the prospective system, the monitoring, the mechanism behind the watched pot that will not boil, in the hours to come. But for now, simply let the fact sit. The feeling is real, the mechanism is real, and the night that feels longest is, very often, precisely the night that is leaving the least trace. The feeling of endlessness and the accumulation of evidence are running in opposite directions, and the darkness is exploiting the gap between them. There is something almost kind about that, if you let yourself feel it. The night that seems to be going on forever is not accumulating against you. It is not building up a debt of lost hours that you will have to pay back. It is barely registering in the only place where time gets written down. Tomorrow morning, the vast and terrible endlessness of tonight will have left, in the reconstruction, something much smaller than it felt. Tomorrow morning, last night will be the night that passed. For now, though, let us follow the mechanism a little further into its quieter depths, because there is one more question the storage size model raises, and it is a question about what novelty actually feels like from the inside. Not from the outside, not in the lab, not in the language of event boundaries and segmentation events, but from the inside, From the position of a mind lying in the dark, very still, trying to understand what it is using to measure the time. The mind, lying in the dark, is not aware that it has no clock. It feels, from the inside, like a conscious experience of duration. The minutes seem to stretch, and the stretching seems to be something directly felt, something the mind has continuous access to. The way you have continuous access to the temperature of the air on your skin. It feels like an ongoing report, a live readout, something that is happening in real time. But the storage size model tells us that at least part of what we call the felt length of a stretch of time is actually assembled after the fact, a reconstruction from stored material that the brain performs and then presents to consciousness as if it were a continuous experience. The reconstruction is fast enough and the presentation smooth enough that you cannot tell from the inside which parts are real-time perception and which parts are retrospective assembly. This is a subtle point, and it is worth dwelling in because it is the point at which the mechanism becomes genuinely strange. You are not simply passively recording time the way a tape recorder records. You are actively constructing a representation of elapsed time from the material that happened to get stored, and then experiencing that representation as if it were a direct perception. When you say the night has been going on for hours, you are not reading an instrument. You are reading a reconstruction. And the reconstruction is built from what was stored. And in the dark, in the monotony, in the repetition, very little was stored, except the feeling of the night going on for hours, which is itself a kind of event, a kind of content, a repeated registration. It is late, I am still awake, this is very long, it is later now, I am still here. These registrations are themselves being stored, and they are being stored as a kind of content, a texture of experience. But notice what they are not. They are not new events, they are not segmentation boundaries. They are iterations of a single thought, the thought that time is passing, that the night is long, that morning is not close, and as they repeat, the repetition suppression mechanism is quietly reducing the brain's response to each one. The first time you registered that it was very late, the brain attended fully. The 50th time, it barely stirs. And each repetition is a slightly smaller contribution to the reconstruction, even as the total sense of duration accumulates. This is not a vicious cycle, though it can feel like one. It is simply the nature of the machine. The machine is doing what it always does. It is trying to reconstruct how much time has passed from the material available to it. And in the particular conditions of a dark and quiet room, with a mind running one thought in circles, the material available is thin. Not absent, you are awake and experiencing, and experience is always leaving some trace, but thin, sparse, a reconstruction with few landmarks. And so we arrive, for the first time, at the shape of the answer. Not the full answer. The full answer includes the other timing system, the prospective one, and the lab studies, and the sleep state misperception data, and the particular strangeness of the minutes before sleep. All of that is still ahead, still waiting in the deeper hours of this story. But the foundation of the answer is now visible, and it is this: the brain measures time by counting what happened. In the dark, with little happening, the measure comes out wrong. It comes out wrong in a specific direction and for a specific reason, and understanding the reason is different from simply being told you are wrong. The light through the blinds has not changed. The room is exactly what it was. The thought you were thinking when you first lay down is still, in some form, the thought you are thinking now, Perhaps the same concern, perhaps the same question, perhaps just the same awareness of lying here, of being awake, of listening to the silence. And none of that is new. The brain has a model of it now, a compressed representation. And it scans it and finds no new boundary, no segmentation event, no oddball to give weight to. And so it deposits another thin layer into the duration reconstruction, and the reconstruction grows, slowly, the way a reef grows, not through accumulation of large dramatic things, but through the slow accretion of tiny similar events, each one barely distinguishable from the last. The reef is the night. It feels immense because it is wide and because it has been growing since the light went out. But almost all of it is the same material, laid down in the same way, in the same darkness, in the same quiet. It is wide and thin, and tomorrow it will compress to almost nothing, the way all such structures compress in the retrospective reconstruction. And you will reach for it and find a vague texture where you expected a solid object. Robert Ornstein, writing in 1969, was trying to understand something that everyone had noticed but few had named precisely: the terrible discrepancy between the time that passes and the time that is felt. He was working in the tradition of researchers who had been trying, for a very long time, to understand why the mind is so unreliable at the task that seems simplest, simply knowing how long something took. He was working in the shadow of a much older observation, one that William James had articulated at the end of the 19th century, and that we will return to in some detail, that the experience of time has two completely different faces depending on whether you are inside a moment or looking back at it from outside. James called the immediate felt present the specious present, and he understood already in 1890 that the relationship between living time and remembering time was not a straightforward one. What Ornstein added, decades later, was the mechanism, not just that the two faces of time differ, but why and what the mind is actually using when it constructs its estimate. Storage size. How much was stored? That is the answer to why memory time and lived time diverge. And the divergence is not a glitch. It is not a failure of the system. It is the system doing exactly what it is built to do, in conditions it was not built for, not for the dark, not for the monotonous, not for the room where nothing changes, and the thought goes around, and the brain's response to it grows quieter with every repetition. The system was built for a world full of light and motion and novelty, a world that generated event boundaries at every turn, a world that was always writing new entries in the storage ledger. And it works beautifully for that world. It is only in this particular world, the world of the still room at night, the world you are in right now, that its seams show. There are no seams in the dark. Or rather, there are. But you cannot see them. You can only feel them as the strange, groundless sense of time expanding without filling, of a night that is somehow both endless and empty, both very long and, you suspect, not as long as it seems. That suspicion is correct. It has a mechanism behind it. It has names: Ornstein, Zacks, Zakay, Pariadath, Eagleman, and it has experiments, and it has data, and it has the quiet authority of something that has been measured and found to be true. And it has one more thing, which is the shape of the comfort it offers. The comfort is not you are wrong to feel this. The comfort is much more specific than that, and much more true. You are feeling exactly what the mechanism produces, in exactly the conditions that produce it, and the feeling is a real perceptual output and not an error of character or of will. The night is not punishing you by going slowly. The mechanism is simply running on the available material, and the available material is thin. And the thinness of the material is, itself, a kind of evidence that less is happening than it seems, that the reconstruction is working with a sparse ledger, that the endlessness is wide but not deep. Let that land gently, in whatever way it wants to land. There is no hurry. The next section of the story is already assembled and waiting, and it will come in its own time, and in it we will meet the other timing system, the one that runs not in memory, but in the present moment, the one that is, right now, telling you how long you have been lying here. And we will find that it, too, is doing something very specific and very explicable with the dark. We will find that it, too, has a name and a mechanism, and that the mechanism makes a particular kind of sense once you see it clearly. But you do not need to see it clearly yet. You do not need to hold the Ornstein model or the event segmentation framework or the oddball effect in conscious attention. They have been laid down, gently, in whatever part of the mind receives things heard in the dark. They are there if you want them. And if you do not want them, if they are already beginning to soften at the edges and blur into the general warmth of a voice in a quiet room, that is exactly the right thing to be happening. That is the mind doing what it does when the boundaries thin out and the reconstruction has little to work with. That is the architecture dissolving. That is the direction of sleep. And somewhere between Ornstein's 1969 insight and the particular stillness of this room, in whatever city or house or quiet corner you are lying in tonight, the mechanism is doing its work, not accumulating against you, not keeping count, just running, quietly, on the available material, finding the ledger sparse, finding the boundaries few, and building from what it has, which is not much, and which is, for once, exactly enough. There are two different ways the mind handles time. Two separate systems, running in parallel, oriented in opposite directions, and producing, when they disagree with each other, the precise condition you are in right now. The researchers who have mapped this territory most carefully, Block and Dan Zakay, whose work across the 1990s stands as one of the more patient and thorough accounts of how duration warps and shifts, gave the two systems names that sound technical, but describe something you already know from the inside. They called the first one prospective timing. They called the second one retrospective timing. And the place where the two systems diverge is, almost exactly, the place where a sleepless night lives. Prospective timing is what happens when you know you are waiting. When you are aware, in the present moment, that time is passing and that you are tracking it. When you sit in a waiting room with no phone and the clock on the wall is the only object of interest. When you stand at a stove watching water in a pot. When you lie in bed in the dark, listening for the sound of the house settling, aware that an hour has gone by and that another hour may be coming. Prospective timing is the system that runs when attention has nothing else to do and turns almost automatically toward time itself. And what Block and Zakay found across multiple experiments, across multiple subject pools, is that prospective timing reliably makes empty intervals feel long. Not slightly long. Substantially long. The more attention you dedicate to the passage of time, the more time appears to be passing. Retrospective timing is the other direction. It runs not in the waiting, but in the remembering. When someone asks you, afterward, how long something took, when you look back at a vacation and try to place how many days it contained, or when you try to account for where the afternoon went, that is retrospective timing, and it works by a completely different method. It reaches back into memory and counts what it finds there. It takes the events, the distinct moments, the things that happened and were stored, and from their number and their density it assembles an estimate of how long the interval must have been. An eventful afternoon leaves a rich record, and the retrospective system, counting that richness, concludes a long time. An empty night leaves almost no record at all, and the retrospective system, finding the ledger nearly bare, concludes a short time, or nothing much, or a blank. And here is where the two systems collide, and where the collision produces something that has been troubling people for as long as they have lain in the dark, wondering what time it was. While you are in the night, the prospective system is running. You are aware that time is passing. You are monitoring it. You have turned a significant portion of your attention toward the dark itself, toward the silence, toward the question of when it will end and whether sleep is coming. And in doing so, you have handed the prospective system exactly the conditions under which it most reliably makes time feel long. No competing events. No novelty to redirect attention. Just the awareness of waiting and the slow accumulation of that awareness, second by pooled second, into something that feels like duration so thick you could press against it. And then morning comes, and you look back. And the night that felt endless while you were inside it leaves almost nothing in memory. Not because you were asleep for more of it than you thought, though sometimes that is true as well, but because the retrospective system is now running, and it is counting what was stored, and what was stored across those long dark hours of a single repeated thought is almost nothing at all. The prospective system said, "This is taking forever." The retrospective system says, "I cannot find much here." And between those two verdicts, the night becomes one of the stranger objects the mind produces, enormous while you are in it, and thin and nearly blank by the time you are out the other side. Block and Zakay called this a fundamental asymmetry in duration judgment. It has a long history before them, and it has accumulated evidence after them. But the core observation is simple enough to state in a single breath: the same interval can feel long and feel short depending entirely on which of the two systems is currently doing the measuring. William James saw this clearly, and he saw it more than a century before the neuroimaging work that would later fill in the mechanism. James, writing in 1890, in that vast and patient book that still reads as though he had sat quietly in a room and simply looked at things until they gave up their structure, noticed that a stretch packed with events feels short while you are living it but long in memory, and that an empty stretch feels long while you are living it but short afterward. He called this the filled time paradox, and he spent considerable effort examining why it should be so, and reaching for a way to talk about time as something the mind does, rather than something the mind passively receives. He had a phrase for the present moment as it is actually experienced. The specious present, he called it, the thin moving window of now that the mind inhabits, which is not a dimensionless instant but a brief span, a few seconds wide, within which experience feels immediate and whole. The specious present is the window the prospective system peers through. And when that window contains nothing but awareness of the window itself, the window feels very wide indeed. This is sometimes described, in less patient terms, as the watched pot effect. A watched pot never boils, or seems not to. Because when your attention is locked entirely on the pot, and on the water, and on the question of when the water will change, there is nothing to interrupt the flow of subjective time ticks, nothing to reset the counter, nothing to fill the accumulator with anything other than more waiting. And the accumulator, doing its job faithfully, records all of that waiting and presents it to consciousness as duration. Dense, slow, considerable duration. The same pot, watched while you are doing something else, comes to a boil seemingly at once. Not because it boiled faster, because your attention was elsewhere, and the time ticks that accumulated did so without your watching them accumulate, and so the interval, when you glance back at it, feels short. You are lying in the dark, and you are, in all likelihood, watching the pot. Richard Zakay and Richard Block developed a formal account of how the attentional direction toward time produces this lengthening effect. They called it the attentional gate model, and the image is a useful one even if the underlying architecture is more complicated than any single metaphor can hold. Imagine a gate that opens and closes between your general attentional resources and a kind of internal sampling mechanism, the part of the mind that checks, periodically, how much time has passed. When attention is occupied elsewhere, by a task, a conversation, a piece of music, a story being told in a quiet room, the gate is largely closed, the sampling mechanism runs slowly, and time accumulates outside your awareness. When attention is freed from external demands and has nothing else to point at, the gate swings open, the sampling rate increases, and the mind checks in on time more often. More checks, more ticks recorded, more material for the prospective estimate of how long this is taking. And lying still in the dark, with nothing to look at, and no sound to follow, and no task to complete, and nothing at all to occupy the attention but the question of whether sleep is coming, the gate is open wide. The sampling mechanism is running fast. Every few seconds, or faster, a check. Still awake, still awake, still awake. Each check is another mark in the ledger of how long this has been going on, and the ledger, when you consult it, is very full, so full, impossibly full, for only an hour, because the ledger does not distinguish between a slow hour and a fast one. It only counts how many times it was consulted. And it was consulted, in the dark, very many times. This is not a character flaw. It is not anxiety in any diagnostic sense, though anxiety can deepen it considerably. It is the attentional gate model running in the conditions that produce its most extreme result. The way any physical system produces its most extreme result when you have arranged its inputs precisely so. You are not bad at sleeping, you have arranged the inputs. There is another layer to this, and it runs beneath the attentional mechanism in a way that took researchers some time to identify, because it is not about attention at all. It is about arousal. About the general activation state of the nervous system and what that state does, quite independently of what you are paying attention to the perceived rate at which time moves. The story that most clearly illustrates this is an old one, and it is not from a sleep laboratory. It is from a house in the 1930s, somewhere in the northeastern United States, and it involves a researcher named Hudson Hoagland and his wife, who was running a fever. Hoagland was a physiologist, the kind of careful and patient observer that early 20th century science produced in some number, people who were comfortable spending long hours watching a single phenomenon from close range and recording what they found without rushing toward a theory. His wife had taken ill. The accounts do not always specify the illness, only that her temperature had climbed to around 104 degrees Fahrenheit, and Hoagland, being a scientist, found himself noticing something about her experience of time. She complained that he was gone a very long time whenever he left the room to fetch something, to speak on the telephone, to do the ordinary things that go with caring for someone ill. The intervals seemed, to her, extended, long, much longer than they were. Hoagland was curious. He had a scientist's instinct to measure things, and so he asked his wife, at various points during her illness and afterward as her temperature fluctuated, to count to 60 at what felt to her like 1 count per second. A minute, subjectively paced, and what he found was that as her temperature went up, her subjective second shrank. A warmer brain ran faster. She reached 60, felt like 60, in less clock time when her temperature was high, which meant that for any given amount of real time that passed, her internal clock had ticked more often, and so the interval felt longer. More ticks, more duration. He called it, with the straightforward naming instinct of that era's scientists, a chemical clock. The idea was that some process in the brain, temperature sensitive in the way that most biological processes are temperature sensitive, ran at a rate that varied with heat. Warm it up, the process speeds up. The subjective clock runs fast, and real time appears to drag, because the internal clock has already counted past where the real clock sits. Cool it down, and Hoagland documented this direction as well. Experiments with cold water and lowered body temperature, the subjective clock slows, and real time seems to move quickly. This was not a fully correct account of the mechanism, as later work would clarify, but the observation at its core was sound and has been replicated in various forms across the decades since. The rate at which the subjective clock runs is sensitive to the thermal state of the brain. And because the thermal state of the brain is tied, in complicated ways, to the general arousal state of the nervous system, because a more activated, more aroused system runs warmer, because the physical chemistry of wakefulness is a warmer chemistry than the physical chemistry of sleep. The aroused brain is the brain that perceives time passing more abundantly. And now consider what happens when you lie awake and worry. Not the content of the worry, not the specific thing you are thinking about, which could be anything, which is almost always something that cannot be resolved in the dark at whatever hour this is, but the quality of the state. High arousal, elevated heart rate, perhaps, muscle tension you may not be consciously noticing. A nervous system running hot in the way that Hoagland's wife's feverish brain ran hot, ticking faster than the clock on the wall, converting each ordinary minute of real time into something that feels, from the inside, like more. This is not metaphor. This is the mechanism. Warren Meck and his colleagues, working through the 1980s and 1990s on what the brain uses to keep interval time, identified another layer of this same phenomenon, and it comes from an unexpected direction. The neurochemistry of the striatum, the cluster of structures deep in the brain that includes the basal ganglia, the same structures that participate in interval timing. Meck's work showed that dopamine, that particular signaling molecule associated in the popular imagination with reward and motivation, but whose actual job in the brain is considerably more varied and precise than those labels suggest, dopamine tunes the speed of the internal clock. States and substances that raise dopamine levels speed the clock up, making time feel stretched and slow. States and conditions that deplete or suppress dopamine slow the clock, compressing subjective time. And while the full dopaminergic picture of the anxious night is complicated, arousal, temperature, attention, and neurochemistry are not neatly separable dials you can turn one at a time. The general direction is consistent. The aroused, vigilant, restless brain is a brain in which the clock runs fast. More ticks per minute of real time. More subjective duration per unit of actual duration. The hour that feels like 4 is not an exaggeration in any morally meaningful sense. It is a readout from an instrument that has been turned up. John Gibbon and Russell Church, working with Warren Meck, built the most influential formal model of this system, which they called scalar expectancy theory. And the model is built around a pacemaker, not a literal anatomical pacemaker, no single neuron whose job is timekeeping, but a functional pacemaker, a rate of neural firing that acts like one, connected to an accumulator that collects the pulses and to a memory store that holds reference durations for comparison. The mathematics of this model are elegant and somewhat involved, but the important part for purposes of a dark and quiet room is this: the pacemaker's rate is not fixed. It varies. It is modulated by attention, by arousal, by temperature, by neurochemical state. Turn up any of those inputs and the pacemaker runs faster. The accumulator fills faster. For the same clock time, more pulses are counted, and the comparison to memory says this is taking longer than it should. This is scalar expectancy theory's description of a watched, anxious night. There is something important to notice about the particular combination of states that defines lying awake and worrying that is distinct from other kinds of unpleasant experience. Stella Drott-Volée and Warren Meck, surveying the literature on emotional arousal and time perception in the mid-2000s, described how different emotions produce different signatures in the subjective clock. A frightening event, a genuinely threatening stimulus, tends to expand perceived duration, the clock runs fast, and time feels slow. But the expansion is largest and most reliable when the threatening stimulus is also novel. When the threat is new. When the fear is sharp and immediate and demands the brain's full orienting response. Novelty, as we have already seen, expands subjective duration through one pathway, the larger neural response, the greater distinctiveness, the richer encoding. Fear expands it through another, the arousal, the dopamine, the pacemaker speeding up. The ruminating, anxious, wakeful night is neither of these. It is high in arousal, the clock is running fast, but it is emphatically low in novelty. The thought circling in the dark is not new. It is, almost by definition, a familiar thought. A thought that has been visited before, perhaps many times before, a thought whose content you know without examining it closely, because you have examined it closely many times and found nothing at the end of the examination that was not there at the beginning. It is a thought without an event boundary. A thought that generates no distinct encoded moment, no fresh stimulus that demands the brain change its processing state. Alessandro Angrilli and his colleagues working in the late 1990s showed that emotional arousal expands duration in conditions where attention is also freely available, where there is nothing else for attention to do but register the arousing stimulus. But that under high attentional load, the picture can reverse, or at least complicate. The point relevant here is not the technical conditions, but the general one, that the combination of high arousal and unconstrained attention on the source of arousal is one of the strongest known levers for producing felt duration. And an anxious, wakeful night arranges both conditions simultaneously. High arousal, attention completely free, pointed at the dark, pointed at the thought, pointed at the question of why sleep is not coming and how much longer this will go on. The pacemaker is running fast, the gate is open, the sampling rate is high, the ticks are accumulating, and the thought in the dark, the one repeating thought, is generating almost no event boundaries, almost no novelty, almost no raw material for the retrospective system to count later. So you are building simultaneously the longest prospective experience the system can produce and the most meager retrospective record it can leave. You are inside the machine that makes an hour feel like 4. And the machine is working exactly as designed. James's filled time paradox contains within it a kind of dark comedy that is easier to appreciate at some distance than in the middle of the night. The interval that feels longest in the living of it, the stretched, monitored, anxious interval, the interval in which you are most acutely aware of time passing, is the interval that leaves the least in memory. And the interval that feels shortest in the living, the busy afternoon, the absorbing task, the state of flow in which the pacemaker's output is not being routed through consciousness, because consciousness is occupied elsewhere, is the one that leaves the richest record and seems, when you look back at it, to have taken a long time. This reversal is one of the odder features of the mind's relationship with time, and William James noticed it with what seems, reading him now, like genuine pleasure at finding something so counterintuitive lurking in such ordinary experience. He described the empty day as feeling long in the present and short in retrospect, and the full day as feeling short in the present and long in retrospect. And he seemed to find in this reversal something characteristic of the mind's fundamental strangeness. That what we experience and what we remember are not the same object. That the experienced present and the remembered past are each built by different mechanisms, answering different questions, using different materials. You are in the experienced present, and the experienced present, tonight, is being built by the prospective system with the attentional gate open and the pacemaker running and no competing inputs to slow the sampling rate. The retrospective system is quiet. It is not needed yet. It will do its work later, tomorrow morning, when you look back at the night and find it thinner and blanker than it felt. But for now, the prospective system has the floor, and it is doing what it always does in these conditions, which is report, this is a very long time. And it is not wrong, exactly. It is not lying. It is giving you its most accurate reading of the inputs it has. The inputs happen to be configured in the way that produces a high count, and so the count is high. There is one more feature of this mechanism worth settling into slowly, because it is the feature that most directly addresses the thing you are actually wondering about, the question underneath all the other questions, the one that does not go away. Not why does time feel different in the dark? That is the scientific question, and we are working through its answer, piece by piece. The question underneath it is simpler and more personal. It is the feeling real? Is the sense of hours passing, of the night being impossibly long, of having been lying here since before any reasonable hour of waking? Is that a real thing that is happening to me, or is it a mistake I am making, a lie I am telling myself, an exaggeration I will be embarrassed by in the morning? And the answer, when it comes clearly through the mechanism, is that it is entirely, verifiably real. Not real in the sense that you have been awake as long as it feels. That part is where the two systems diverge, and we will come to the evidence for that divergence in its proper time, which is coming. But real in the sense that the feeling is a genuine output of a genuine process. The prospective timing system is actually producing a count that high. The pacemaker is actually running at that rate. The accumulator is actually that full. This is not distortion in the sense of error. This is the system reporting what the system measured, and the system measured something real. That the gate was open, that the sampling rate was high, that the arousal was high, that the dark was monotonous, that the thought was circular, that all of these inputs were present and doing what they do. The feeling has a name. Sleep state misperception, or what clinicians sometimes call paradoxical insomnia, is the recognized category for the specific and reproducible finding that people who report lying awake for hours often, when compared against the objective recording of brain activity across the night, the polysomnography, the electrodes tracing the actual architecture of sleep, show sleep where they reported wakefulness. Not always. Not every reported hour of wakefulness is secretly sleep. But often enough, and consistently enough, and specifically enough in the particular shape of the discrepancy, that it is recognized as a real and nameable phenomenon rather than as simple misreporting. And the astonishing part, the part that matters for what you are feeling right now, is that the people in these studies are not wrong about their experience. They are not lying. They are not misremembering in any deliberate or controllable sense. Their brains have generated a felt sense of wakefulness, a felt sense of time passing, a genuine prospective experience of lying in the dark for a long time, and that felt sense is real. The experience is real. The mechanism producing it is the one we have been describing, and the recording on the paper, the squiggly lines that the polysomnograph traces out through the night, the lines that show slow waves and spindles, and the unmistakable architecture of sleep, those are also real. Two real things, one felt, one measured, and between them, the space where duration lives, where reconstruction happens, where the brain does what it always does in the absence of direct information, its best. This is not a small thing to understand about yourself. It is, in fact, the kind of understanding that takes a genuine weight off. Not all the weight, not the tiredness, if it is there, not the frustration, which is real and reasonable, but the particular weight of believing that you are the only one this happens to, or that there is something wrong with your relationship to sleep that does not exist in other people's relationships to sleep, or that your report of the night is unreliable in a way that reflects badly on you. That weight is not warranted. The mechanism is shared. The experience is recognized. The name exists because the phenomenon exists and has been documented in enough people that it deserved one. What the brain is doing in the dark is not malfunctioning. It is measuring, with the instruments available, what is available to measure and reporting what it finds. And what it finds, when the gate is open and the pacemaker is warm and the night is quiet and monotonous and the thought is circling, is duration. More duration than the clock would show if you could check it. More duration than the polysomnograph would confirm. But not more duration than the system, given its inputs, was going to report. Hudson Hoagland's feverish wife was not wrong about the time either. She was right that he was gone a long time. She was right within her own system's reference frame, the reference frame in which the clock runs at a rate set by her body temperature and not by the clock on the wall. The clock on the wall said 10 minutes. Her internal clock said something longer. Both clocks were doing their jobs. They just were not synchronized. And the gap between them is not a malfunction. It is a demonstration of the mechanism which is always running and always under the influence of the body's current state, and which has no particular obligation to match a timepiece manufactured to track the rotation of the earth. The nights you have lain awake, all the specific nights, the ones with their specific worries or their specific silences or their specific shapes of darkness in the room, those nights were not lies you told yourself. The time you experienced was the time the system measured. The system measured what it had to work with. It had arousal and attention and monotony, and no external Zeitgebers to anchor it. No bright light flooding the retina to say here is morning. No hunger or thirst marking the hour. No sound from outside to interrupt the loop, just the dark and the thought and the slow, warm running of a brain that has been told by all its inputs that this is a very long night. And it believed them, because it has no way not to. There is no clock organ to override the reconstruction. There is no separate channel of timing information that runs independently of attention and arousal and novelty and checks them when they go too high. There is only the distributed system, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, the supplementary motor area, the insular cortex collecting the body's signals, and the system runs with what it is given. What it is given, right now, is changing. Not dramatically, not in the way that a loud noise changes things, or a sudden light, or a thought that jolts you into a new and urgent alertness. More slowly than that, more the way that water in a glass slowly comes to match the temperature of the room it sits in, without you noticing any single moment of the change, only the end state, which is different from the start state, without there being any clear line between them where the change occurred. The voice in this room is one thing that is changing it, not because the words are solutions to anything, not because knowing about attentional gates and pacemaker models will make the night shorter, but because attention pointed at something other than the dark, and the thought is attention not pointed at the dark and the thought. The gate is not as wide open as it was. The sampling rate is not as high. Something else is here. A description of a mechanism. A story of a feverish woman in a house somewhere in the 1930s. A cave in the French Alps. A man who lost a month. And the something else is filling space that was previously filled only by the awareness of waiting. Hoagland's insight was that the clock is biological, that it runs in chemistry and temperature and the physical state of the system that produces it, which means it is not fixed, which means it changes as the system changes, which means the clock running in the dark of your particular room, in your particular body, right now at whatever point in the night this is not the same clock that was running an hour ago, or 2 hours ago, or however long it has been since you first lay down and first felt the night beginning to stretch. The pacemaker modulated by arousal slows when arousal slows. The gate regulated by the availability of attention narrows when attention finds something else to rest on. The ticks are still accumulating, they always are, until sleep arrives and the system goes offline in that distinctive and gentle way that sleep takes everything offline, but they are accumulating now in a different context. A context with a voice. A context with the names of researchers who spent their working lives trying to understand exactly this. The gap between what the clock says and what the body knows, the distance between the recorded night and the felt one. And Zakay and Block's asymmetry is still true. It will be true in the morning when the retrospective system looks back at this and finds, in the record, less than the prospective system reported. That asymmetry does not go away simply by knowing it exists. But knowing it exists changes the meaning of the prospective report. When the system says this has been very long, and you know why the system says that, not as an abstraction, not as a piece of information filed away under useful facts about sleep science, but as something that has been laid down slowly in the quiet, in whatever way things are laid down when they arrive in the dark. The report does not dissolve, but it loosens. The report is still there, the felt sense of duration, but around it there is now also this, a description of the mechanism, which is not an accusation and not a correction, but simply an account. The account says, the gate was open. The pacemaker was warm. The thought was circling. The system measured, faithfully, what was there to measure. And what was there to measure was a night that felt long. Because it was long in the only dimension the prospective system tracks, the density of its own attention, folded back on itself, counting its own counting. James's specious present, the thin window of now, is still moving forward. It always is. It does not stop for understanding, or for the description of mechanisms, or for the story of a woman with a fever whose husband was not actually gone as long as it seemed. It moves at the same rate it always moves, which is the rate at which it moves, which is not something anyone has fixed to a number that holds still. But the material it is moving through is changing. The window is finding now something slightly different in it than it was finding before. Not sleep, not yet, or not necessarily yet, but something adjacent to sleep, something that has the texture of a state in which the gate begins to close on its own, where the sampling slows, not because you have told it to, but because the conditions for keeping it fast have gently, gradually shifted. This is what the mechanism looks like from the inside. From the outside, it looks like a person lying in a room, breathing at a pace they are not monitoring. It looks like the particular stillness that precedes sleep, which is not the stillness of having given up or the stillness of trying very hard, but the stillness of a system running on less input than it had before, finding fewer reasons to check in, letting the accumulator fill at its own pace rather than at the pace anxiety sets. And the two systems, the prospective, reporting the long night, the retrospective, waiting to find less in the morning than the night seemed to contain, are both still running as they always are, as they will always be. But the relationship between them, right now, is shifting toward the configuration that produces sleep. The prospective system is losing some of its material. The attentional gate is narrowing. The felt duration is still there, but its fuel, the attention, the arousal, the open gate, is finding its way towards something lower. William James, in 1890, had no way of knowing what the brain structures involved in this were, had no basal ganglia maps or dopamine assays or polysomnography traces to consult, and yet he noticed it anyway. He noticed that the experienced present is a construction, that memory and experience are different objects, that the same time can be long and short depending on which face of it you are looking at. He noticed it because it is one of the plainer features of consciousness once you slow down enough to observe it. And the slowing down required to observe it is itself a kind of help, a kind of narrowing of the gate, a kind of reduction in the sampling rate, because careful observation of a single thing is attention organized and pointed, not scattered and circling. The pacemaker runs at whatever rate the body gives it. Tonight, the body is giving it a little less than before. And yet the proofs exist. They were gathered at real expense, in real places, by real people who gave months of their lives to the dark. The first of them went in 1938, long before Siffre, long before the Andex bunker, long before anyone had given the name chronobiology to the science of what happens to a human body when you remove the clock from the room entirely. Nathaniel Kleitman was already one of the most careful sleep researchers in the world. He would go on, 19 years later, to help discover REM sleep. to help reshape everything medicine thought it knew about what happens inside the sleeping brain. But in the summer of 1938, he was primarily interested in a different question. He wanted to know whether the human body could be persuaded to run on a day other than 24 hours. Whether the cycle was truly locked, built into something as fundamental as chemistry, or whether it was simply a habit, a rhythm learned from the sun, changeable if you changed the conditions. He chose Mammoth Cave in Kentucky. And this choice, when you consider it, had a simple and lovely logic. Mammoth Cave is the longest known cave system in the world, a network of passages extending more than 400 miles through the limestone beneath the hills, and its interior sits at a temperature so stable, so removed from the variation of the outside air, that it holds at roughly 54 degrees Fahrenheit through summer and winter alike, through day and night, through drought and flood, without detectable change. There is no dawn in Mammoth Cave. There is no dusk. The dark is the same dark at noon as it is at midnight, and it had been the same dark for as long as anyone had been measuring. Kleitman went in with a young colleague, Bruce Richardson, and they spent 32 days underground. They brought artificial lights on a schedule they controlled. They tried to shift their bodies onto a 28-hour day, a day artificially longer than the one their bodies had been keeping since birth. And what they found, in the data they gathered from their own temperature curves and sleep records, was that Richardson, younger and perhaps more plastic in his rhythms, partially shifted. Kleitman, older, did not. His body held something, some internal insistence on approximately 24 hours that resisted the imposed schedule even in the absence of any external cue to enforce it. The 28-hour day did not take. This was not a failure of the experiment. It was, if you look at it honestly, one of the more important results in the history of the science. There is something in the body that counts. Not a clock in the way a watch is a clock. Not a mechanism ticking away in some accessible compartment, but a distributed rhythm, something older than watches. Something that had been running in living things long before any organism had eyes to register the sun. Kleitman and Richardson in the dark of Mammoth Cave were the first systematic demonstration in human beings that this rhythm was real and that it ran on its own. The work continued in other caves and other bunkers through the following decades. In Andechs, a small town in Bavaria, Germany, a research station opened in the 1960s where Jürgen Aschoff and Rietke Wever ran a long series of bunker isolation experiments. Volunteers entered apartments built underground, apartments with no windows, no clocks, no radios, no newspapers, no information of any kind about the time of day or the date of the calendar. They ate when they were hungry, slept when they were tired, turned lights on and off as they chose, and were simply recorded, their temperature and activity tracked continuously by instruments they could not see. And when Aschoff and Wever compiled the data from these experiments, from dozens of subjects who had lived this way for weeks at a time, they found that the human free running period, the natural length of the day the body kept when freed from all external anchors, settled at something close to, but somewhat longer than 24 hours. Their early estimate was approximately 25 hours, and this figure circulated through textbooks for years, repeated by teachers and writers and anyone who found it usefully vivid, the idea that the human body, left alone, wants to live slightly longer than the planet turns. The figure was later refined. In 1999, Charles Geisler and colleagues published a careful forced desynchrony study in Science, using a protocol that disentangled the body's intrinsic period from the influence of light-dark cycles that the Andex studies had not fully controlled for, and the corrected value that emerged from that work was 24. 18 hours. Not 25, 24 hours and about 11 minutes. Close enough to the solar day that the small daily correction made by morning light, a shift that the eyes perform without any conscious effort, the way a winding of a watch returns it to true, is enough to keep the internal clock synchronized with the external one indefinitely. The body's day is almost exactly the planet's day, and sunlight is the small adjustment that keeps the two in register. But the adjustment is small only because it is made daily. Remove it for weeks, and the drift accumulates, and what accumulates in the drift is exactly what Siffre encountered in 1962 at the bottom of the Scarrison Cave, and what he encountered again, more dramatically, in 1972. The second experiment was called the Midnight Cave Study. The cave was in Del Rio, in the high desert country of Texas, and Siffre entered it under the support of NASA, which was interested, for obvious reasons, in what happens to human perception of time during extended isolation, interested in what a mind does to itself when there is nothing outside to orient by and everything must come from within. He went in for what would amount to roughly 6 months, and what happened to his experience of time was stranger and in some ways more disturbing than the simple drift of the first experiment. His body, freed from the sun, did not settle into a 24 or 25-hour rhythm. It began to stretch. Some of his cycles reached toward 48 hours, long periods of wakefulness, followed by very long sleeps, the whole pattern expanding like a material under low heat, slow and gradual. Until he was, in his own felt experience, living what seemed like a normal series of days and nights, while the calendar outside was turning at twice the pace. He felt no dramatic disorientation in the moment. He simply lived his days as they came, one after another. As any of us lives our days. He had no sense that anything was wrong, and that is the part that requires a pause. The absence of a sense that anything was wrong is itself the most interesting finding, because it means that the internal experience of time, the felt quality of a day passing, is generated almost entirely from within and can be sustained at essentially any pace without the person inside it noticing the pace has changed. Near the end of the Midnight Cave stay, the researchers outside ran a simple test. They asked Siffre to count to 120, to count 1 beat per second, in his own judgment, until he reached the number that would represent 2 minutes of real time. He counted. He reached 120, and on the recording outside, 5 real minutes had passed. His subjective second, the inner beat he was following, had stretched to approximately 2.5 real seconds. The clock inside him was running at roughly half the speed of the clock outside. Not dramatically, not in a way he could have detected by feel, just quietly, measurably, provably wrong. He thought he was counting seconds. He was counting something longer, and he had no way of knowing. This is the proof that matters for the night you are in right now. Not because your subjective second is running at half speed, not because you are losing months in the dark, you are not, and the circumstances are entirely different, but because the experiment demonstrates, in a form you can hold in your mind and examine, that the internal sense of time is not a measurement, it is an estimate. It is the output of a system that is doing its best with the materials available, and when those materials change, the output changes with them. without any alarm sounding, without any felt sense of error, without any way from the inside to know that the number being produced has drifted from the number on the clock. Siffre counted to 120 and believed he had counted 2 minutes. He had counted 5. The gap between the belief and the reality was not dishonesty. It was the normal operation of a system that was doing exactly what it always does, just in conditions unusual enough to make the drift visible. The conditions you are in tonight are also unusual, though in a different direction. You are not in a Texas cave for 6 months. You are lying still, in the dark, with few new things entering, and the system that estimates how long you have been lying there is doing exactly what it always does, reconstructing from available material, inferring from what it has stored, producing a number from the texture of the hours. And the texture tonight is thin, and a thin texture, reconstructed, produces a large number. Now consider the dreams. There is a belief, persistent and vivid, that has attached itself to dreaming the way certain other beliefs attach themselves to the night. The belief that an entire epic, a narrative lasting what feels like hours, can flash through the dreaming mind in the span of a single second or a few heartbeats. That the dream compresses time in the way a novel compresses a life, so that a whole journey from beginning to end can be experienced in the moment before the alarm. This belief has been told and retold and has the feel of something true, in part because the waking recall of dreams is often fragmentary and brief relative to the richness of what you seem to have experienced inside them. But the experiments do not support it. William Dement, working with Nathaniel Kleitman in 1957, this was the same Kleitman who had gone into Mammoth Cave 19 years earlier, and Dement was his student, one of the researchers involved in the discovery of REM sleep itself. Dement and Kleitman ran an experiment in which sleeping subjects were woken either 5 minutes or 15 minutes after entering REM sleep and asked to judge, from the felt length of the dream they had just been in, which of those intervals they thought they had been dreaming. And the subjects could reliably distinguish the two. They did not confuse 5 minutes for 15. They did not report that both felt like the same compressed flash. The dream that lasted 15 minutes felt, to the dreamer, approximately like something that lasted 15 minutes. The dream that lasted 5 minutes felt approximately like 5. Dream time, in REM sleep, appears to run at something close to waking time, not at some radically accelerated pace. And then Stephen LeBerg went further. LeBerg, working at Stanford in the 1980s, studied lucid dreamers, people who had developed the ability to know, while inside a dream, that they were dreaming, and he devised a way to receive signals from them while they slept. Before sleep, he and a trained dreamer would agree on a code, a specific series of left-right eye movements that the dreamer would perform at marked moments inside the dream, at the beginning of a counted interval, and again at what they judged to be the end of 10 or 15 seconds. Because the eyes move even in REM sleep, and because eye movements can be read from outside, these signals appeared on the recording. And what LeBerg found was that the intervals the dreamers counted inside their dreams, and marked with eye movements, took approximately the same real time as the equivalent count would take while awake. The dream second and the waking second were not radically different objects. The dreaming mind was not running at some exotic compressed speed. It was running, as nearly as the experiment could measure, at the pace of the world. The epic in a second is largely a legend of the night, a story that got told because the morning recall of a long dream often comes quickly, and the speed of the recall was mistaken for the speed of the original experience. The recall is fast because memory is always a reconstruction, always a summary, always briefer than the thing it represents. You can recall a year in 30 seconds. The year itself took a year. Recalling the dream quickly does not mean the dream went quickly. The dream went, as nearly as anyone has been able to measure, at approximately the pace of everything else. This matters tonight because one of the beliefs that can make the night feel longer is the belief that the dreaming is happening in some separate, compressed dimension where time moves differently from the room you are lying in. It does not, or at least it does not move so much faster as to render the night unaccountable. The night you are in, the one on the clock, and the night you will have experienced, including whatever dreaming comes, are, in their broad proportions, the same night. And now, the fall. David Eagleman and his colleagues Chess Stetson and Matthew Fiesta ran an experiment in 2007 that was published in PLOS 1, and the experiment was, in its basic design, something that sounds like it could not have been approved. Volunteers were taken to a structure designed for a controlled backward freefall, a SCAD tower, a thing that drops you safely but also terrifyingly from a significant height so that you experience the sensation of falling before a net or harness catches you. And strapped to each volunteer's wrist was a device Eagleman's team had built, a small display that flashed numbers at a rate just slightly too fast to read under normal visual attention. The design of the experiment was based on a question that almost everyone who has been in a frightening accident reports. That time seemed to slow. The car going into the railing, the step off the curb that missed, the fall from the ladder. In the retrospective account, these moments are almost universally described as stretched, as lasting longer than they could have, as having an unusual internal detail and clarity. And the question Eagleman wanted to answer was whether this slowing is real, whether the brain, under high threat, actually shifts into a mode of faster processing, the way a computer running faster can resolve more frames per second, or whether the slowing is something else, something constructed. If the brain actually slowed time in the moment, the volunteers falling should have been able to read the numbers on the display. The numbers were flashing too fast for a brain running at normal speed, but not too fast for a brain running significantly faster. So, if time really slowed, the falling should have unlocked the ability to read the wrist display. It did not. The volunteers fell. The display flashed. They could not read it. Time did not actually slow in the moment of the fall itself. But, and this is the part that earns its place in the science, when they were asked afterward to estimate how long the fall had lasted, they said it had lasted approximately 36% longer than it actually had. They remembered a longer fall than the one they took. The duration had expanded, not during the experience, but in the reconstruction of it afterward. And the mechanism the researchers proposed was exactly the one this whole account has been describing. A fearful event lays down memory more densely than an ordinary one. More detail per second, more encoding of each moment, because the system processing it is running with high arousal and high attention. More material is stored, and when the memory is later reconstructed into a duration estimate, more material in storage reads as more time elapsed. The fall felt longer in memory because more of it had been kept. The slowing was real, but it happened in the archive, not in the clock. What Eagleman's falling study demonstrates, in a form as clean and as verifiable as anything in this field, is that felt duration is a product of the reconstruction and not of the lived moment. The falling volunteers were not confused or dishonest when they said the fall felt long. The fall did feel long. It felt long because the memory system had done its job thoroughly, had kept more of that dangerous moment than it would have kept of a safe one, and the reconstruction produced, faithfully, the report of a long event. The perception was accurate to the memory. The memory was enriched by arousal. The clock was never consulted. And now the piece that may matter most to you tonight. There is a category in the clinical literature of sleep medicine called sleep state misperception. It is sometimes called paradoxical insomnia. And what it describes is a gap, a measurable and reproducible gap, between what a person reports about their night and what the recording shows. When the recording is a polysomnography trace, the gold standard of sleep measurement, the continuous record of brain electrical activity, eye movement, and muscle tone gathered through electrodes placed on the scalp and face, the technology that Dement and Kleitman helped to develop, when you compare that trace to what the person lying under those electrodes reports in the morning, the two accounts often disagree. Not by a small margin. People who describe lying awake for most of the night, who give detailed accounts of their wakefulness, the sounds they heard, the thoughts they followed, the minutes they watched accumulate, are sometimes shown traces in which the brain activity is unambiguously that of sleep for the majority of the recorded time. The recording says they slept. They say they did not. And the important word here is the one that takes a moment to accept: not. Not lying. Not misremembering in the casual sense in which we all misremember things. The experience of wakefulness was genuine. The report of it was honest. What was wrong was not the report, but the correspondence between the experience and the brain state producing it. In light sleep, in the transitional stages at the edge of sleep and wakefulness, the brain can produce an experience that feels like wakefulness, thoughts that seem to run with waking coherence, an awareness that seems unbroken, while the external recording shows something else. The felt continuity of consciousness, which we take as our surest evidence that we are awake, is itself a product of the very system we are trying to observe, and that system, in certain sleep stages, continues to produce the feeling of wakefulness even as the body and the brain move into sleep. This is not a small finding. It is, for anyone who has spent a long night convinced they never slept, one of the more quietly important things that science has to offer. Because it means the conviction can be genuine and the conviction can still be wrong. Not wrong because you are confused or irrational, but wrong in the way that Siffre's count to 120 was wrong. The system produced its best estimate from the material available, and the material available in early sleep does not clearly distinguish sleep from wakefulness the way later deeper sleep does. There is also the question of how the gap looks at the entry to sleep. In the minutes before full sleep, in the drifting transition called hypnagogia, the state in which the thought drifts without direction, in which images appear without being chosen, in which the self-monitoring that keeps track of whether you are asleep or awake begins to loosen. Event boundaries become unreliable. The hypnagogic state is one in which the architecture that the waking brain uses to mark time is gently disassembling itself. Thoughts slide from one to another without the normal markers of transition. The monitoring that would register you have moved from one topic to another becomes intermittent, then occasional, then absent. And because the event boundaries are dissolving, the reconstruction of how long this period lasted becomes, afterward, almost impossible. People describe falling asleep suddenly, with no warning, because the warning that would have registered, the felt shift, the noticed transition, never assembled from the materials that were dissolving as it tried to form. The last clear thing was a thought, and then it was morning, and the interval between them contains almost nothing the memory can use to reconstruct it. So the night contains at least 3 distinct sources of distortion. The retrospective reconstruction, which assembles duration from stored events and finds very little on a monotonous night. The prospective monitoring, which watches the dark and samples it and accumulates, felt time from the attention it gives to the watching. And the hypnagogic erosion, which dismantles the boundary-making system just at the moment, the question, when did I fall asleep, would need it most. The sleep trackers on the wrists of the people who check them in the morning are attempting to navigate all of this from the outside, using movement and heart rate to infer what stage the brain is in. A method called actigraphy, which measures the body's motion over time and uses that motion, or the absence of it, as a proxy for sleep versus wakefulness. It is a reasonable proxy, but it is not the same thing as reading the brain directly. A person lying very still while awake can look, to an actigraph, like a sleeping person. A person in a restless stage of sleep can look, to the same device, like someone awake. The number the tracker produces in the morning is itself a reconstruction, itself an estimate, itself built from inference rather than direct measurement. And the clinical literature has found, in validation studies comparing actigraphy to polysomnography, that the 2 records often diverge, sometimes significantly. This does not mean the trackers are useless, but it means the number they offer has to be held lightly, understood as one estimate among several rather than as the objective ground truth against which the subjective experience should be judged and found wanting. There is a recognized phenomenon called orthosomnia, described by Kelly Barron and colleagues in a 2017 paper in the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. The phenomenon of worsening sleep precisely because of anxiety about what the tracker reports. People lying awake, worrying about whether they are getting enough of the stages the app has told them, are important. Checking the display in the night. Adjusting their position in search of better readings, training their attention, in short, exactly onto the clock, exactly into the prospective monitoring mode, exactly into the state that the attentional gate model predicts will make the night feel longest and rest most difficult to reach. The tracker produces a number. The number is an estimate. The estimate can be accurate and still fail to account for the subjective experience that preceded it. And the subjective experience, as we have spent this whole descent establishing, is itself a reconstruction produced by a system that does not measure time, but instead assembles an approximation of it from whatever it finds to work with. And tonight what it finds to work with is thin. This is the thing to hold, now, in the quiet. Not as a corrective, not as an instruction, but as a fact with a shape. The night that feels long, because a long night and a monotonous night produce the same output from the reconstruction system. They are, for the purposes of felt duration, indistinguishable. A night in which many things happened, and a night in which one thought returned again and again will feel approximately the same length, possibly longer for the one thought than for the many things. Because the many things carry their own internal structure, their own event boundaries, their own small moments of surprise that break the felt continuity into countable pieces. The one thought, circling, lays down almost nothing. The reconstruction, given nothing to count, reports long. But the report is not a measurement. The report is the output of a process, and the process runs on material, and the material tonight is sparse, which means the clock and the felt duration are not running at the same rate. The felt duration is ahead of the clock. It has been ahead of the clock for some time. And the gap between them, the extra felt time, the sense of hours passing that exceeds the hours on the clock, that gap is exactly what the science predicts from exactly the conditions you are in. Siffre walked out of the Scarrison cave and believed it was August. It was September. He had been underground for 61 days, and somewhere in the accumulation of days without light, without clocks, without the small external markers that normally keep the internal estimate aligned with the external reality, he had lost an entire month. Not because something had gone wrong, because the system that estimates time had been running with less to work on. And the estimate had drifted, and the drift had accumulated quietly over weeks into something a calendar could show him, but his own mind could never have detected from the inside. You are not in a cave. The drift you are experiencing is not of that order, not of that duration. But the mechanism is the same mechanism, running in the same brain, operating on the same logic. There is no organ that measures the dark. There is only the reconstruction, and the reconstruction is built from what happened, and on a still, dark, quiet night, what happened was not much. The volunteers in Eagleman's study fell through the air and believed in memory that they had fallen longer than they had. Because the fall was encoded with density, with arousal, with the full attention of a brain convinced that something important was happening, and all that encoded density became, in reconstruction, a felt duration larger than the clock would confirm. You are experiencing the opposite mechanism toward a similar result. Not a dense, arousal-rich encoding that produces an expanded memory, but a sparse, low-novelty encoding that produces an expanded present, an attentive, watching, monitoring present that samples itself over and over in the absence of anything else to attend to, and each sample is another tick of the felt clock, and the felt clock runs ahead. And yet the morning always comes. And the morning, almost without exception, finds less of the night gone than the night contained. The total counted in the dark exceeds the total confirmed by the light. This is not a recovery, not a correction, not the world setting the record straight. It is simply the retrospective system producing its own estimate from the other side. The morning sees a night with few events in memory, and few events in memory reads as less time, and less time is what the morning reports. So you have been, in one sense, both right and wrong about the night. Right that it felt long. Right that the feeling was real. That it was not invented. That it was not the kind of exaggeration we use when we say we have done something 1,000,000 times. The feeling had a mechanism, and the mechanism produced a genuine output, and the output was the experience of a long night. And wrong, or more precisely, working with a number that exceeds the clocks, about how much of the clock the feeling represents. The feeling and the clock are running on different fuel. The feeling runs on what the reconstruction finds, the clock runs on the rotation of the planet, and on a still, dark, monotonous night, those two measurements come apart. This is what the caves found. This is what the bunkers confirmed. This is what the sleep laboratory records, again and again. In the gap between the polysomnography trace and the morning report. The felt night is real. The felt night is long. The felt night is not the same thing as the measured night. Nathaniel Kleitman went into Mammoth Cave in 1938 and found that something in the body resisted a 28-hour day, that there was a counting happening below the level of any conscious effort, a rhythm maintained in the absence of all external cues, and that rhythm, in its most accurate modern measurement, runs at 24 hours and 11 minutes. Close enough to the day that the sun can correct it in moments every morning, distant enough from it that the night, in the right conditions, can feel as though it has lasted longer than any clock would confirm. You are in those conditions now. And the last thing the science has to offer for tonight is the simplest. What you are feeling, the sense of a long night, the hours that seem to have accumulated without arriving anywhere, the familiar conviction that the darkness has been going on since something earlier than it has, that feeling is not a mistake. It is the correct output of a system doing its job correctly. The system was given a sparse night and it produced a large number, and that number is what consciousness reports as duration. Nothing went wrong. The instrument is reading what it was given to read, but the instrument is reading a small store of material as if it were a large one. The night is quieter, emptier of distinct events than it feels. The store is thin. The reconstruction is doing what the reconstruction always does, which is to turn the texture of what it has into an account of how long it took. And the account it has produced tonight is longer than the clock, which means the clock is closer to morning than the feeling is. Somewhere outside, the planet continues its turn. The light that will reach your windows eventually is already on its way from a sun below the horizon, moving toward you at whatever pace the rotation sets, indifferent to how long the dark has seemed. The darkness will end at the same moment it would have ended, whether this felt long or short. Because the darkness ends when the planet turns, and not when the reconstruction reaches its conclusion. The reconstruction is still running. It is running on whatever you give it, and what you are giving it now is quieter than before. There is less activity to mark. The monitoring is lower than it was an hour ago. The gate is narrower. The pacemaker, taking its signal from a body that is warmer in the dark, but cooling now, ticking at the pace that dopamine and attention and arousal set, ticking a little slower than it was. The isolation studies found that a body in the dark, freed from all external signals, settles into something close to its natural period. 24 hours and 11 minutes, the intrinsic day, the day the body would keep if nothing outside corrected it. What corrects it in ordinary life is light, a small daily correction, a signal reaching the eyes, and from the eyes to a small cluster of cells in the hypothalamus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, sitting just above where the optic nerves cross, and from there to the rest of the body, resetting the clock, returning the running period to the period of the planet. That correction will come in the morning. The clock is already closer to it than the feeling suggests. If there is anywhere in the world you are settling towards sleep tonight, I would genuinely like to know where. The comments are there, and I do read them. People have written from rooms overlooking the ocean, from apartments above city streets still lit at 2 a.m, from small houses at the edge of fields where the dark outside is a different kind of dark than the dark inside a city, quieter, older, more complete. Wherever you are, the night is the same night, the mechanism is the same mechanism, the reconstruction is running the same way. The brain in the dark is the same brain in all those different places, counting what it finds, building its estimate from what happened, finding, tonight, a little less than it might have found, and reporting accordingly. You have been lying here long enough. The reconstruction has noted that. But the clock, which does not care what the reconstruction reports, has moved by less than the reconstruction suggests. There are more of these slow descents here, more evenings spent somewhere between the science and the settling, more careful accounts of ordinary and extraordinary things, offered at this same unhurried pace, for whenever you want them. For now, let the count go. The reconstruction will keep running whether you attend to it or not. And attending to it gives it more material to work with, more samples, more ticks of the felt clock, more of exactly what makes the night seem long. The gate closes faster without the watching. The accumulator fills at the pace the body sets when the attention stops adding to it. The dark outside your window is the same dark it has been, older than any calculation. Indifferent to how long it has seemed, the planet is turning. The light is on its way. You have done enough for one night. Whatever remained of the day, you have already put it down. You're moored safe in the sleepy harbour now. Drift off,